No empire in history has survived what America is doing right now. Rome did not collapse because of war. It collapsed because it debased its currency to pay for debts it could not afford. The Weimar Republic didn't die on the battlefield. It died when the printing press destroyed the German mark. History is screaming a warning, but Wall Street is refusing to listen. The United States is no longer just borrowing. We have entered a terminal debt spiral. The current fiscal situation is a 350-pound two-pack-a-day smoker on the ICU table. This is not a metaphor for a healthy economy facing a minor setback. This is a patient and critical condition. For the first time, America's borrowing levels are the same size as the entire economy. The federal budget is on a path that is mathematically unsustainable. Most people think the next crisis will look like 2008, a sudden banking crash. They are wrong. This time, the call is coming from inside the house. The danger isn't a subprime mortgage. It is the U.S. Treasury bond itself. We spend way more than we bring in, and we borrow to cover a deficit that is skyrocketing. This is not accidental mismanagement. It is a system designed to strip wealth from the saver and transfer it to the debtor. The invisible dog fence is approaching. You won't know you've hit it until the shockwave destroys your purchasing power. We are not here to ask how to fix the deficit. It is too late for that. We are here to investigate what happens when the mathematics finally break the greatest economy on earth. Welcome to the endgame of the American dollar. The most dangerous question in economics right now is also the simplest. If the debt is so bad, why hasn't the sky fallen yet? We have been hearing about the national debt for decades, yet the dollar remains the world reserve currency and the grocery stores remain stocked. This creates a false sense of security, a normalcy bias that blinds investors to the cliff edge. To understand why the collapse hasn't happened yet, you have to understand the invisible dog fence theory. In this scenario, you can run freely across the yard. You feel no resistance, you see no barrier. But there is a buried electrical line defining the limit of your territory. You don't know you have hit the wall until you cross it, and the shock collar engages instantly. The United States seems almost intent on finding out exactly where that tipping point is. Since 1776, debt has been central to the American experiment, but for the vast majority of that history, the ledger was managed with the intent of repayment. Today, we are running full speed toward the perimeter. The market signals are quiet, but that silence is not safety. It is merely the distance remaining before we trigger the shock. The U.S. has not yet seen a tipping point, but math suggests the fence is much closer than the Federal Reserve admits. We must dissect the beast to understand what kills it. This debt is not a monolith. It is a compound fracture of fiscal policy. When we break down the historic fiscal hole the U.S. finds itself in, the origins are distinct. Roughly one-third of this debt comes from tax cuts. Another third comes from spending increases. The final third comes from emergencies. The 2008 financial crisis, the pandemic, and multiple expensive wars. The emergencies are arguably the only justifiable time to borrow. In World War II, the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio spiked to over 100%. But that was a temporary surge to defeat global tyranny. Once the war ended, the spending stopped. The economy grew, and the debt was inflated away. That was a just war debt. What we are witnessing today is fundamentally different. This is a structural deficit. We are borrowing not to fight a war or build the interstate highway system, but simply to keep the lights on and fund tax cuts that did not pay for themselves. The other two-thirds of the debt, the tax cuts and spending increases, were choices, not necessities. We have normalized a wartime budget during peacetime. The system is designed to bleed cash. This is not a temporary wound, it is hemophilia. There was a brief moment in history when the U.S. government actually feared the math. In the early 1990s, there was immense uncertainty about the economy, driven by deficits. Robert Rubin, a co-senior partner at Goldman Sachs who became the 70th Treasury Secretary, looked the Clinton administration in the eye and called the deficit a threshold issue. Rubin understood that if the government didn't control its spending, the market would punish it. The administration made hard political choices. For a brief, shining moment starting at midnight after the budget deals, America launched a new era of balanced budgets and surpluses. It was the first time since 1969. The bond market rewarded this discipline with stability. That era is dead. It was murdered by political expediency. Today, the discipline of the Rubin era has been replaced by the nihilism of modern monetary theory. But you cannot cheat gravity forever. Kent Smetters and his team at Wharton have built models to simulate the current trajectory of U.S. fiscal policy. The results are not ambiguous. The model tells us in real time. It gets worse. The Wharton model indicates that under current law, the debt load will become so heavy that fixed income markets, the bond markets, will collapse. This isn't a prediction for the next century. The model shows that the economy essentially blows up within 20 years. We are no longer talking about if the fence will shock us. We are calculating the voltage. The models predict a collapse when the market refuses to buy the debt. But who are these buyers, and what happens when they go on strike? To understand the trigger, we have to look at the sheriffs of the financial world, a group of investors who once forced presidents to their knees and who are waking up again. To understand the crisis, you must first understand the plumbing. The process of American debt is often obscured by political rhetoric, but the mechanics are brutally simple. When the government spends more than it collects in taxes, it creates a deficit. To cover that gap, the U.S. government issues and sells treasuries. These are essentially IOUs, promises to pay back the money with interest at a future date. For decades, this system worked because the world had an insatiable appetite for dollars. But the laws of economics are catching up. Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, views the economy like a doctor observing a patient. He notes that we are seeing plaque build up in the system. His research across centuries of debt cycles points to a terrifying imbalance. The supply of debt that is going to be produced by deficits is now greater than the demand for that debt. This is basic supply and demand 101, but applied to the bedrock of the global financial system. When you flood the market with too many bonds, and there aren't enough buyers, the price of those bonds falls. And when bond prices fall, the yields, the interest rate the government must pay to borrow must rise to attract investors. We are entering a phase where the sheer volume of paper being printed is overwhelming the market's capacity to absorb it. When the government refuses to be responsible, the market appoints its own enforcers. In the 1980s, economist Ed Yardeni noticed a specific behavior among investors reacting to the raging inflation of the prior decade. There was a palpable fear that they would get burned again. Yardeni coined the term bond vigilantes to describe these investors. The concept is fascinating. If the Federal Reserve and the government won't act as the sheriffs in town to manage the economy and keep inflation down, the bond vigilantes will do it for them. They don't use badges or guns, they use sell orders. By collectively dumping U.S. debt, they force bond prices down and yields up. This spikes borrowing costs for the entire economy, effectively putting a chokehold on government spending and slowing growth until order is restored. In 1983, Yardeni noted that these vigilantes were concerned about a $200 billion zero-cents deficit. Today, the deficit levels are 10 times that amount. The bond vigilantes are now more powerful than ever. The bond market has become the Mike Tyson of the financial world. Policymakers might have a big, beautiful plan, but the market is ready to punch them in the face. Unlike politicians, the bond market is not polite. It often just breaks things instead of bending them. The vigilantes extract their price through a specific mechanism known as the term premium. This is the extra compensation investors demand for holding long-term debt instead of short-term debt. It is the price of uncertainty. If the term premium is rising, it means investors are pricing in higher risks for the future, risks like runaway inflation or fiscal recklessness. Recently, this metric has been flashing red. In January, the term premium hit its highest level in more than a decade. It remains elevated because the market is no longer confident in the long-term stability of U.S. fiscal policy. When people start worrying about tail scenarios, catastrophic outcomes, they demand to be paid more to hold the risk. This isn't just theoretical. The smart money is already moving. PIMCO, the world's largest active manager overseeing $2 trillion, 0 cents, publicly announced it was cutting exposure to long-dated U.S. debt. Their reasoning was clinical, deteriorating deficit dynamics. They aren't running from bonds entirely, they are diversifying into other countries that look at least as good as the U.S., but run much more prudent overall fiscal policy. When the biggest bond managers in the world start stepping away from American debt, it is a signal that the risk-reward ratio has fundamentally broken. The vigilantes have the power to crash the market to enforce discipline. But what happens when the government refuses to accept the crash and chooses a different, more insidious path? To understand the government's countermove, we have to look past the default and into the printing press, a strategy that saves the bond market but destroys the currency. There is a fundamental misunderstanding among the public about how the American debt story ends. When people hear debt crisis, they imagine the government shutting down, checks bouncing, and a formal declaration of bankruptcy. They imagine the United States becoming Argentina, Greece, or Venezuela. This is a dangerous illusion. A formal default, where a borrower simply cannot make payments on a debt, is highly unlikely to happen to America. Why? Because the rules of the game are rigged in Washington's favor. Unlike a household or a corporation, the United States government owns the printing press. As former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan famously admitted, the United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. But there is a second half to that truth, a fine print that the government rarely highlights. Greenspan continued, "We can guarantee cash benefits, but we cannot guarantee their purchasing power. This is the crux of the deception. The government will always send you the check. The number on the check will be correct. But by the time you cash it, the money won't buy what it used to. They will honor the debt in nominal terms, but they will default on the value. This leads us to the real danger, a scenario economists call monetization, but which you should understand as a soft default. When the bond vigilantes stop buying the debt because the interest rates aren't high enough, the Federal Reserve steps in as the buyer of last resort. They don't have savings to buy these bonds. They simply create new credit out of thin air. We saw this movie during the pandemic. We just cranked up the printing press. The mechanism is simple and devastating. That action means there are significantly more dollars in the economy, chasing the exact same amount of goods and services. This is not a complex economic mystery. This is exactly where inflation comes from. For the financial anxiety crowd asking, is my savings being stolen? The answer is yes. But it's not being stolen by a thief in the night. It's being siphoned by policy. When the government prints money to pay off its own bad debts, they are diluting every dollar you worked for. It is a transfer of wealth from the saver to the debtor. It is a hidden tax that requires no legislation and no vote. History shows that countries struggling with high debt almost always choose this path. They inflate their way out, destroying the middle class to save the sovereign. To understand the timing of this erosion, we look to Ray Dalio, one of the most successful global macro investors in history. Dalio has studied the rise and fall of empires over the last 500 years, and he sees the United States repeating a specific, terminal pattern. He is deeply concerned about government debt levels, a worry that has escalated since the 2008 financial crisis. Dalio describes himself as a doctor looking at a patient. He watches the plaque build up in the system. For years, he said it was merely unhealthy, but now the diagnosis has changed. The supply-demand picture for U.S. debt is now very severe. His forecast is chillingly specific. When asked about the likelihood of a crisis related to debt levels, Dalio stated there is more than a 50% chance that we will experience a trauma within 3 years, give or take a year or two. He warns that if we don't deal with this well, the consequences will be dire. His research found that these cycles of big debt bubbles and busts are almost as predictable as the tides. We are currently in the late stages of the long-term debt cycle, the phase where the debts become unpayable and the currency must be sacrificed to keep the system alive. If the currency is being sacrificed, holding cash is no longer a safety net, it's a guaranteed loss. But if the US dollar wobbles, surely other nations will step in to stabilize the system, right? The next phase of the crisis isn't just about money. It's about a complete loss of faith, as demonstrated by a terrifying preview from our closest ally. For those of you thinking, the US is too big to fail, look across the Atlantic. In the fall of 2022, the United Kingdom, a G7 nation, a financial superpower, and a stable democracy, experienced a sovereign debt crisis that nearly incinerated its pension system. It didn't happen over years. It happened in days. The catalyst was Prime Minister Liz Truss. She unveiled a bold plan to grow the economy through massive tax cuts amounting to £45 billion. Her rhetoric was familiar. Cut taxes to spur growth, but there was a fatal flaw. She had no plan to pay for it other than borrowing more money. The market's verdict was instant and violent. The bond vigilantes we discussed earlier didn't negotiate. They attacked. Immediately, the British pound collapsed and investors dumped UK government bonds at a frantic pace. The yield on the 30-year gilt spiked, moving more in a few days than it typically moves in years. This was the market screaming, "We do not trust your math." Here's where the story gets darker and where the self-educated investors need to pay attention. Why did a drop in bond prices nearly destroy the UK economy? Because of what was hiding in the shadows. Leverage. The local pension funds, the bedrock of retirement for millions of British citizens, were forced to sell assets to manage their risk, but the mechanics were terrifying. These funds were using something called liability-driven investment strategies. Essentially, they were using derivatives to hedge their portfolios, using government bonds as collateral. When the bond prices crashed, the value of their collateral plummeted. This triggered massive margin calls. To raise cash to pay these margin calls, the pension funds had to sell more bonds into a falling market. This created a doom loop. Selling drove prices down, which triggered more margin calls, which forced more selling. The system was hours away from total insolvency. The Bank of England had to panic print money to come in and stabilize the market, effectively bailing out the government's bad policy. The political cost was absolute. Prime Minister Truss never regained credibility. She resigned after just 6 weeks in the role, becoming the shortest-serving Prime Minister in British history. She didn't lose an election. She lost the bond market. The terrifying question for us is, can this type of crisis, where the market quickly loses confidence, happen in the United States? Currently, PIMCO, the bond giant we mentioned earlier, states that the risk remains low in terms of probability for the US America has advantages Britain doesn't. The US dollar is the global reserve currency, and the economy is incredibly dynamic. We attract a significant share of global capital just by being the biggest player in the room. However, PIMCO also warned that they are cutting exposure to long-dated US debt because of deteriorating deficit dynamics. They explicitly stated that if you don't see signs of attempting to get debt under control, the probabilities of a crisis-level situation will steadily go higher with time. The UK crisis proved that confidence is fragile. It takes decades to build the creditworthiness of a nation, but it takes only days to destroy it. We are running the same experiment as Liz Truss, just on a much larger, more dangerous scale. The market is patient, until it isn't. And when the US bond market finally breaks, there is no bigger central bank to bail us out. When the bond market breaks, it doesn't just destroy portfolios, it destroys security. It forces a nation to choose between paying its lenders or defending its borders. This brings us to the final and perhaps most chilling cost of the debt spiral. And the interest bill becomes so large, it disarms the military. If the bond market collapse is the heart attack, the crowding out effect is the slow strangulation that precedes it. We have entered a new era where the cost of our past decisions is eating our future alive. Thanks to a combination of soaring debt and higher interest rates, the U.S. is expected to spend nearly $1 trillion, 0 cents on interest payments this year alone. To put that number into perspective, the Congressional Budget Office expects net interest costs in 2025 to surpass spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and national defense. Think about that. We are paying more to service the past than we are to defend the present or heal the sick. This phenomenon squeezes out every other part of the budget. Whether you want tax cuts, higher defense spending, or better social programs, the answer is no. Not because of ideology, but because of arithmetic. The interest piece of the pie is growing so fast it is consuming the resources needed for education, infrastructure, and scientific research. We are becoming a nation that functions as an insurance company with an army, and soon we won't even be able to afford the army. This leads us to the most terrifying implication of the debt spiral. It is a threat to American sovereignty. Back in 2010, Admiral Michael Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was asked what he believed was the biggest threat to national security. His answer shocked the nation. It wasn't terrorism, it wasn't Russia, and it wasn't China. He responded that the most significant threat was our national debt. Reporters expected him to name a weapons system or a rogue state, but Mullen understood that economic strength is the foundation of military power. He warned that as interest rates rise and debt increases, it would squeeze the defense budget, right at a time of increasing international and geopolitical concerns. His prophecy has come true. The U.S. crossed a critical threshold last year. We are now spending more on interest payments than on national defense. We are literally paying our creditors, including geopolitical rivals, more than we pay our soldiers. Experts warn that leaders like Putin in Russia and Xi Jinping in China see this fiscal vulnerability as a sign of weakness. President Xi has spent over a decade talking about the United States being in decline. When a superpower is forced into a game of chicken with another superpower, but owes money to everyone at the table, it blinks first. Finally, we must address the moral crime at the heart of this system: generational theft. The crowding out effect isn't just about government budgets, it's about your life. It used to be acceptable to borrow from future generations because we assumed they would have a higher standard of living. That assumption is dead. Right now it is a very risky moment for younger generations who do not know exactly what they are inheriting. Economist Kyla Scanlon warns that young people risk never having access to Social Security, Medicaid, or Medicare. But the cruelty of the system is that not only are they not going to have access to those services, but they are also going to have to pay for those who did before them. This is a double-edged sword. A growing debt load limits the government's ability to fight off a future emergency. In 2008, and during COVID, we used debt to get our way out of the crisis. But what happens when the debt is the crisis? You can't use debt to get out of a debt problem. It's too late at that point. We are entering an emergency-prone world with our hands tied behind our backs, leaving the next generation defenseless against the storms to come. The check has arrived, and the account is empty. The politicians know this, the bond market knows this, and now you know this. So how does the story end? It ends not with a solution, but with a cold realization about the people in charge. Do not look to Washington for a savior. Eventually, the solution to the deficit comes down to the hard work of budgeting, but we are in a dangerously polarized moment. Partisan politics has become far more important to lawmakers than actually governing. Both parties have adopted all of the easy things. They both love cutting taxes and growing spending. This is why historian Niall Ferguson argues that the debt itself is no longer the primary danger. He believes the political division in the country has risen to become our biggest threat. It is a deadlock that ensures the ship will sink because the crew is too busy fighting over who gets to steer. Here's the reality we must face. Mathematics does not care about your political affiliation. Mathematics has no emotions, and mathematics knows no mercy. We are living through the final chapters of a massive debt supercycle that has been building since 1980. The invisible fence is right in front of us. The bond vigilantes are waking up. The question is no longer if the spiral will spark the next crisis, but when. When the music finally stops, the system will not protect you, it will protect itself. Financial history always repeats itself. Those who understand the pattern will prepare. Those who ignore it will become liquidity